There is a moment in the history of science when curiosity becomes something else entirely, when the pursuit of knowledge crosses a line so fundamental, so human, that it can never truly be uncrossed. Most of us believe that line is obvious. Most of us believe we would recognize it immediately if we saw it being approached. Most of us are wrong, because the people who crossed that line were not monsters. At least, not in the way we imagine monsters to be. They were doctors, scientists, researchers with degrees on their walls and families at home and colleagues who respected them. They worked in real hospitals and real universities. They published papers. They attended conferences. They believed, many of them, that what they were doing was necessary, that the ends justified the means, that the people they were using, the human beings, strapped to their tables and locked in their wards, were acceptable costs in the pursuit of a greater good. This is the story of what happens when science forgets that the subject of its research is a person. This is the story of the labs where humans were the experiment. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the world in which it began. Not the world of today, with its ethics boards and informed consent protocols and international laws governing human research. A different world, a world where the boundaries of medicine were still being drawn, where the possibilities of science seemed almost limitless, and where entire categories of human beings were considered, by those in power, to be less worthy of protection than others. The story doesn't begin in one place or at one moment. It begins across decades and continents, in the operating rooms of antebellum America, in the prisoner of war camps of World War II, in the rural clinics of the American South, in the government-funded laboratories of the Cold War. It is not a single story. It is many stories, woven together by a single thread. The belief that some human lives matter less than others, and that belief, in the hands of science, becomes something almost incomprehensibly dangerous. Let's begin in the 1840s. In Montgomery, Alabama, a surgeon named J. Marion Sims is developing what will become one of the most important surgical techniques in the history of women's medicine. He's working on a procedure to repair vesicovaginal fistulas, a devastating condition that affects women after traumatic childbirth. The procedure he develops will eventually save countless lives and earn him a statue in Central Park, a place among the founders of modern gynecology. To develop that procedure, he experiments on enslaved black women without anesthesia, repeatedly. Some of the women undergo the surgery more than 30 times. Sims later writes that he does not use anesthesia on these women partly because he believes, as many did at the time, that black people feel less pain than white people. This is not a fringe belief in the 1840s. It is widely accepted in American medical culture. It shapes the treatment of black patients for generations to come. The women Sims operates on have no choice. They are enslaved. Their bodies do not legally belong to them, and so their suffering becomes the raw material from which modern gynecological surgery is built. Their names are almost lost to history. We know a few of them. Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy. They underwent the most intimate violations possible, obeyed and obeyed with no power to refuse, and no recognition of what they endured. When Sims finally perfects his technique, the credit goes to him. Teehee women who made it possible are, for most of history, footnotes at best. This is where the story begins, not in a secret government lab, not in a foreign country. In plain sight, in the accepted medical practices of a nation that had already decided, constitutionally and culturally, that certain human beings were property. Move forward a century. The world has changed officially, at least. Slavery has been abolished. The language of human rights is beginning to take shape internationally. And yet, in the rural counties of Alabama, an experiment is beginning that will last for 40 years and become one of the most notorious examples of medical abuse in American history. It is 1932. The United States Public Health Service launches a study in Macon County, Alabama. The official name is the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. The stated goal is to observe the natural progression of syphilis in black men who have not received treatment, to understand scientifically how the disease develops when left to run its course. There are 399 men enrolled in the study. All of them are black. All of them are poor. All of them are sharecroppers or tenant farmers in one of the most economically devastated counties in America. Many of them cannot read. They are told they are being treated for bad blood, a local term used to describe a range of ailments. They are told the government doctors are helping them. They receive free meals, free transportation, free burial insurance, and in exchange for these gifts, they allow the government doctors to monitor their health, take their blood, and observe what happens to their bodies over time. What they are never told is that they have syphilis. What they are never told is that they are receiving no treatment. What they are never told is that the entire purpose of the study is to watch them deteriorate. And then, in 1947, something happens that makes the Tuskegee study shift from deeply unethical to something almost incomprehensible. Penicillin is established as a standard treatment for syphilis. A cure exists. It is widely available. It is being given to syphilis patients across America. The men in Tuskegee are not given penicillin. The study continues for another 25 years as those men develop heart disease, neurological damage, blindness, and other devastating complications of untreated syphilis. The government doctors continue to observe and record and publish papers. The men die. Their wives are infected. Their children are born with congenital syphilis, and the study goes on. It takes a whistleblower to end it. In 1972, a public health service investigator named Peter Buck, who has been raising internal objections for years, takes his concerns to a journalist. The story breaks in July 1972, on the front pages of newspapers across the country. The public reaction is one of shock and outrage. The study is terminated immediately. After 40 years, at that point of the original 399 men, 28 had died directly from syphilis. At least 100 more had died from related complications. 40 of their wives had been infected. 19 of their children had been born with congenital syphilis. A class action lawsuit follows. A settlement of $10 million is reached. Each surviving participant receives a lifetime of free medical care. In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologizes on behalf of the United States government. 8 of the original participants are still alive to hear it. But Tuskegee, as devastating as it is not the only story. And in some ways, it is not even the most extreme. On the other side of the world, in a complex of wooden buildings on the outskirts of the Chinese city of Harbin, a secret is being kept that will not fully emerge for decades after the war that contains it ends. It is the late 1930s. Japan has invaded Manchuria and is fighting a war across Southeast Asia. And within the Imperial Japanese Army, a unit has been created unlike any other. It is called Unit 731. Its official designation is the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Its actual purpose is the development of biological weapons to be tested on human beings. The commander of Unit 731 is a Japanese army surgeon named Shurishi. He is brilliant, ambitious, and utterly devoid of moral constraint. He believes that Japan's path to military supremacy runs through biological warfare, and he believes that the only way to develop truly effective biological weapons is to test them on living human subjects under controlled conditions. The subjects are primarily Chinese, Korean, and Russian prisoners. They are referred to within the unit not as prisoners, not as patients, not even as people. Te arekajet maruta. In Japanese, the word means logs. As in lumber, as in raw material. What happens inside Unit 731's facilities is almost beyond the capacity of language to describe. Prisoners are infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. They are observed as the diseases progress. When they die, they are autopsied to study the effects. If they survive, they are infected again with something else. Vivisections are performed on living prisoners without anesthesia. Not because anesthesia doesn't exist, but because the researchers want to observe organs and systems in their living, unanesthetized state. Prisoners are subjected to extreme cold to study frostbite. Limbs are deliberately frozen and then thawed, repeatedly, to observe tissue death. Prisoners are placed in pressure chambers to study the effects of altitude on the human body. They are spun in centrifuges. They are subjected to X-ray radiation until they die. They are deprived of food and water and sleep, systematically, while their vital signs are measured. Estimates of the total number of people who died in Unit 731's experiments range from 3,000 to as many as 12,000. The number may be higher. Many records were destroyed when Japan surrendered in 1945. And here is the element of this story that darkens it further, that implicates more than one nation in its horror. When the war ends, American intelligence officers arrive in Japan with a question for Shurishi and the scientists of Unit 731. The question is not how to prosecute them. The question is, what data did you collect, and can we have it? In exchange for immunity from war crimes prosecution, Ishii and his colleagues hand over their research. Decades of data, gathered at the cost of thousands of lives, is transferred quietly to the United States military's biological weapons program. Ishii lives until 1959. He dies of throat cancer, never having faced trial, never having been officially prosecuted for what he did. Many of his colleagues go on to successful careers in Japanese medicine, industry, and academia. The experiments do not stop with the end of World War II. If anything, the post-war period becomes one of the most active eras of human experimentation in history, much of it funded by governments that had just finished fighting a war in the name of human dignity. In the United States, between the late 1940s and the 1970s, a series of experiments are conducted on citizens who have, in various ways, been removed from the full protection of society. Prisoners are used to test pharmaceutical drugs, pesticides, and radioactive materials. Patients in mental institutions are exposed to experimental treatments without their knowledge or consent. Soldiers are ordered to stand in open fields near nuclear test sites to observe the psychological effects of witnessing a nuclear detonation. In one particularly chilling series of experiments, the United States military exposes soldiers to mustard gas in enclosed chambers, deliberately, to study the effects. The soldiers are not told what they are being exposed to. Some develop severe chemical burns. Some suffer lasting respiratory damage. Many are told, for decades, that they cannot speak about what happened to them. Some are still fighting for recognition and compensation today. In Guatemala between 1946 and 1948, American researchers working under the auspices of the Public Health Service deliberately infect prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and sex workers with syphilis and gonorrhea. The goal is to test whether penicillin can prevent the diseases after exposure. The subjects are not told what is being done to them. The study is kept secret. It is discovered only in 2010, when a historian named Susan Reverby stumbles upon archived documents while researching the Tuskegee study. President Obama calls the Guatemalan president to apologize. A presidential commission calls the experiments clearly unethical. The United States government acknowledges that more than 1,300 people were deliberately infected without their consent. No charges are ever filed. There's a document that emerges from the Nuremberg trials of 1947 that attempts to draw a permanent line around all of this. It is called the Nuremberg Code. It is 10 principles developed in response to the Nazi medical experiments conducted in concentration camps that are meant to govern all future human research. The first and most fundamental principle is simple. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. And yet, in the years that follow the Nuremberg Code's creation, study after study is conducted in the United States and elsewhere that violates this principle completely. The Tuskegee study continues for another 25 years after Nuremberg. The CIA's MKUltra program operates in full awareness of the code it is violating. The Guatemala experiments are conducted by the same researcher, John Cutler, who will later be involved in the Tuskegee study. How is this possible? How do people who know the rules continue to break them? Part of the answer is institutional momentum. Once a study is underway, once funding has been allocated and careers have been staked on results, there is enormous pressure to continue. To stop is to admit that something was wrong from the beginning, and that admission carries consequences that the people involved are often unwilling to face. Part of the answer is dehumanization. Every one of these studies selects its victims from populations that have already been marginalized. The enslaved, the incarcerated, the mentally ill, the poor, the racially oppressed. When you have spent your entire life in a society that treats certain people as less than fully human, it becomes not easy, exactly, but possible, to design a study that reflects that assumption. To look at a man in a prison cell or a woman in a psychiatric ward and see a research opportunity rather than a person with a life and a family and a future. And part of the answer is belief. A genuine, sincere, deeply held belief that the knowledge being gathered is worth the cost, that the suffering of a few will prevent the suffering of many. That science, be its nature, is a moral good, and therefore the actions taken in its service must also, ultimately, be good. This is perhaps the most dangerous belief of all, because it is the hardest to argue with, and it is the one that has been used to justify almost every atrocity in this story. The modern system of research ethics that exists today, the institutional review boards, the informed consent requirements, the international guidelines, is built directly on the wreckage of these experiments. The Belmont Report of 1979, which established the foundational principles of American research ethics, was written specifically in response to the Tuskegee study. The Declaration of Helsinki, the international standard for medical research, has been revised multiple times in response to emerging evidence of abuse. Every protection that exists today for anyone who participates in a medical study exists because, somewhere in the past, someone was harmed without that protection. Every informed consent form, every ethics review, every right to withdraw from a study at any time, for any reason, without penalty. All of it paid for in suffering. That is not a comforting thought, but it is an important one, because it means the system we have now is not inevitable. It was fought for. It was built, piece by piece, from the evidence of what happens when it doesn't exist, and that means it can be eroded, gradually, quietly, when the pressure to produce results becomes greater than the commitment to protect subjects, when funding is tight and oversight is loose, when the people making decisions convince themselves that the ends justify the means. It has happened before, in places that looked, from the outside, like legitimate institutions of science and medicine. It can happen again. There is a woman whose name most people have never heard, but whose story captures something essential about all of this. Her name is Henrietta Lacks. She is a black woman from Baltimore who was diagnosed with cervical cancer in 1951 and dies at the age of 30. During her treatment at Johns Hopkins Hospital, cells are taken from her tumor without her knowledge or consent. Those cells turn out to be remarkably durable, the first human cells ever to survive and reproduce outside the human body in a laboratory setting. They are named HeLa cells, after Henrietta Lacks, and they've become one of the most important tools in the history of biomedical research. They are used in the development of the polio vaccine. They contribute to cancer research, genetics research, virology research. They are sent into space. They are used in laboratories on every continent. For decades, Henrietta Lacks's family does not know any of this is happening. When they find out, they discover that the cells taken without consent from their mother and grandmother have generated billions of dollars in commercial value, and they have received nothing. No compensation, no acknowledgement, no credit. Henrietta Lacks's contribution to science is, by any measure, extraordinary. It saved lives, millions of lives, arguably, and it was taken from her without her knowledge, by a system that did not consider it necessary to ask. She is not a victim of wartime cruelty or Cold War paranoia. She is a patient in a respected American hospital in 1951, and still, the rules do not protect her. Still, she is used without consent. Still, what belongs to her, her own cells, her own body, is taken in service of a science that will benefit everyone except her and those she loves. So what do we do with all of this? We cannot undo what was done to Annika and Betsy and Lucy. We cannot give back the years stolen from the men of Tuskegee, or the health taken from the prisoners of Unit 731, or the memories erased from the patients in Montreal. We cannot compensate adequately for any of it. The harm that was done exists in the past, and the past does not change. But we can refuse to forget it. We can insist on knowing it. We can teach it to people who would rather look away, and we can use it to build a more honest understanding of what science is and what it is capable of, in both directions. Science is the most powerful tool human beings have ever developed for understanding the world. It has extended our lives, eliminated diseases that once killed millions, unlocked the secrets of our own biology, and open doors to the universe itself. Its potential for good is almost boundless, and that is precisely what makes it so dangerous in the wrong hands, or in the hands of people who have convinced themselves that their hands are the right ones. The labs where humans were the experiment were not all secret. They were not all underground. Many of them were in plain sight, operating with government funding and institutional approval, reviewed by committees, and reported in journals. The horror was not hidden in darkness. In Monte Casas, it was published. What was hidden was the humanity of the people inside. The fact that the person strapped at the table, or locked in the ward, or told to stand near the blast site was a full human being, with a name and a history and a right to say no. When that recognition disappears, science does not become neutral. It becomes something else. Something that wears the face of progress while doing the work of cruelty. The question that history leaves us with is not whether this has happened. It clearly has. The question is whether we are paying close enough attention to recognize the early signs when it begins to happen again. Whether we are willing to ask, clearly and without flinching, who is being used, who is not being asked, whose suffering is being counted as an acceptable cost. Those questions are not comfortable. They never have been, but they are the only thing standing between science and the worst version of itself. And they begin with a single, fundamental acknowledgement. The person in the lab is not the experiment. The person in the lab is a person.